This morning's message is based on a Bible passage on Acts 28. Now, Acts 28 is the last chapter of Acts, and it's a story about Paul, and it's one of those stories that reads like an adventure story, but I think I quite like the story. It tells us a little bit about life, what life feels like for us, and how God is operating in our lives. So we'll start with the Bible passage. Oops. If you could put the first slide on, please. Oh, yeah.
All right, let's go. Acts 28, 1 to 10. Once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. The islanders showed us unusual kindness. They built a fire and welcomed us all because it was raining and cold. Paul gathered a pile of brushwood, and as he put it on the fire, a viper, driven out by the heat, fastened itself on his hand. When the islanders saw the snake hanging from his hand, they said to each other, "This man must be a murderer, for though he escaped from the sea, the goddess Justice has not allowed him to live." But Paul shook the snake off into the fire and suffered no ill effects. The people expected him to swell up or suddenly fall dead, but after waiting a long time and seeing nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. There was an estate nearby that belonged to Publius, the chief official of the island. He welcomed us to his home and showed us generous hospitality for 3 days. His father was sick in bed, suffering from fever, and healed him. When this happened, the rest of the sick on the island came and were cured. They honoured us in many ways, and when we were ready to sail, they furnished us with the supplies we needed.
Thank you. So it's kind of a cool story, and the story begins with once safely on shore. And if we don't know any context, it kind of, what we read is that, they landed safely on shore, they traveled there by ship, they landed on Malta. Malta was a smaller island, quite a pretty little island. I actually have pictures just to give you a little bit of, that's Malta. And that's the harbour, that would have existed back then, maybe not looking quite like that. So they arrived, the islanders were very friendly, and they were warmed by the fire, a little bit of an incident with a snake there, but he was fine anyway. And then they were hosted by the governor, the premier of the island, and then they travelled on. They did amazing miracles, Paul did amazing miracles, and they got all the supplies they needed, and off they went. So if you look at the story like this, it sounds like a fairly positive story. And if you're into traveling and evangelism, you might think, I wouldn't mind doing ministry like that. I think I've got another one. Isn't it pretty with the colored boats? Now, the Greek word for arriving safely is diasozo. Dia means to go through, and sozo means to deliver from a danger. And it describes a little bit more what actually happened. Now, if you look at the previous chapters, what we discover is that Paul had actually spent 2 years in prison in Caesarea, and he was on the ship as a prisoner, and he was being brought to Rome, where he would stand before Caesar and stand trial. So there was that going on. Then in the previous chapter, chapter 27, I think I've got, okay, so here we've got Caesarea. It's probably about 2,000 k's to Rome, so it's a longer trip. And so they had to take certain stops. When they stopped at Fair Havens, up there in the middle, Paul said to the captain, look, it's winter, and maybe we shouldn't go on traveling because winter was hurricane season, and so it wasn't really safe to travel. The captain didn't listen, and they set out. And so in the previous chapter, what happens is that they're being hit by a hurricane. They have to throw their cargo overboard. They start drifting. They have no idea where they are. They drift for 2 weeks and eventually give up all hope of being saved. What happens then is that they see land. That's Malta, the tiny, tiny bit. There's Italy, there's Sicily, the bigger island, and the tiny spot is Malta. So they see land, the ship starts falling apart, and whoever can swim swims to shore, and who can't swim grabs a plank and drifts to shore. So this is when we hear they arrived safely. So looking at the context to get a much clearer picture. And my point is that when we look at just a smidgen, just at the challenge in front of us, just at one thing, at one little moment, we miss the whole story. We don't actually get the context of it. So you've got to look at the whole picture in order to understand what's going on in Paul's life, in order to understand what's going on in your life. And that's this is what it, could have looked like when they were arriving rather than sailing into harbor. So you've got to look at the whole picture, and that's the title for my message this morning. If I had been in Paul's position at that point, I probably would have thought, are you kidding me, God? I've been in prison, I've been shipwrecked, it's raining, I'm cold and freezing, and now a viper, like poisonous snake, is biting me. Seriously, God? Have you ever had a moment like that where you kind of thought, like, seriously, God? I've told some stories about her before. That's Lisa Harper. She's a preacher, public speaker. I really love her. So she said, I was listening to one of her stories, and she says that this was when she was in her 40s or around 40. She'd be in her 60s now, or she'd be around 60, about my age. So she says when she was like close to 40 or 40, she was dating this amazing and really handsome man. They'd been dating seriously for about a year. When she thought, like, okay, this is headed towards marriage, in her mind, she was already organizing stuff. She was thinking about the dress she would be wearing. And then he ghosted her right before the 4th of July. Never heard from the guy again. And she says, like, I can tell you his name now. Like, it's been long enough. His name is Larry Big Fat Liar Pants. So now here she was, and they had booked to go for the 4th of July. They had booked to go to an event, couples event, and she's like, I can't possibly go to the couples event now. Still hurting a bit. And then a friend of hers rang her. Her name was Kim, and Kim said to her, look, a couple of us girls are getting together. Why don't you come along? Now, Kim was going through a terrible divorce. The kids were with the ex, and so the girls were getting together. And Lisa thought, oh, okay, great. Now I'm going to spend the day with all the sad single ladies with cats. But she decided she'd come, and she thought, well, Kim doesn't have a husband anymore to do things for her around the house, and she was quite handy with power tools. So she brought her power tools and wanted to put up some shelving in Kim's garage. And so she's there up on the ladder, screwing things into the wall and whatever not. And the ladder is starting to slip. So she's up there 3.5 meters high. What is that? 12 feet. And the floor's really slippery. So ladder is starting to slip. And she looks down and sees some, those tomato trellises, those spiky things. And trying not to, like, she knows, can't stop it. She doesn't want to fall on those. So flailing her arms, trying to avoid them. And she falls from 3.5 meters, hits the floor, is knocked out, and lies there bleeding. And so Kim comes in, sees her bleeding and on the floor, and she broke her ankle too, trying to attend to her. And Kim goes and brings a friend in the medical field and kind of goes, so what do I do with her? Like, ask her questions. Is she oriented? And Lisa says, so she comes back asking me all these historical questions. And she said, I never liked history anyway. And this was just not the day I was planning to have. And I just wanted to go home. So Kim goes back and forth, ringing the ambulance. And at one point she comes back in and she says, Reva is dead. And so Reva was that little dog that Lisa had been looking after, like the family that got it for their kids. The kids turned up being allergic, and so they had to give the dog away, but it was a terrible dog and no one wanted it, so Lisa had taken the dog in. So she had brought the dog and put him on the fence outside, like leashed him up, and had planned to go for a run with the dog before the party. So when Lisa was lying there and Kim was attending to her, she forgot about the dog, and the fireworks went off outside. So the dog, being tied up, went crazy and choked herself to death. And so but she said her friend was one of those people that get really, that kind of laugh when they're nervous. So she'd come and kind of go, Reva's dead. and I put him in the freezer. And Lisa's like, what? You put my dog in the freezer? At first she thought it was some horrible joke, and she didn't think it was funny. But then, yes, turned out Reva was dead and was in the freezer. And so Lisa, at that point, she said, like, at that point, I thought, this isn't my life. I was supposed to plan my wedding, pick out a wedding dress, and now my man, I've lost my man, I've lost a tooth, and my dog is in the freezer. Like, are you serious, God? Can you relate? Like, maybe you haven't come off a ladder, but I think we all have had moments where you kind of go, like, seriously, I've had enough. Like, more? Seriously, more? Now, Jeremiah 29, God has a good plan. Jeremiah says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So the Bible tells us that God has good plans for us, but why does it sometimes not seem like that? And I think the issue here is with all these, with that story too, is if we're only focusing on that little bit of our lives and we don't see it with a bigger perspective that God sees it, if you just look at what is happening in the moment, it's very easy to get disheartened and to miss what God is actually doing in our lives. Now, God doesn't inflict horrible things to us. Lisa also, like, she keeps insisting God is good. He's a good God. He doesn't do that to us. And I don't think Paul was bitten by a viper because God was sitting in heaven and going, okay, what else can I do to him? Like, has he had enough yet? But it's because, you know, like, vipers bite if you stir them up, and especially if you chuck a piece of wood on them. And Lisa, if she stands on top of a ladder on a slippery floor, like, there is a chance you might come off and hurt yourself. But God can use even this. Psalm 33 says, the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purposes of his heart through all generations. Now, for Lisa Harper, that point in life was a little bit disheartening. But the bigger picture was that she didn't end up getting to a man who, like, had a flawed character, and also, like, she said, like, you know, he went on to marry another girl, but he's divorced. So she didn't end up with a man and possibly getting divorced from him. Instead, she focused on education. Like, she got a master's and a doctorate in theology. She's the author of so many books. Like, she's an amazing public speaker. And, like, always wanted to be a mom. And in the end, like, she ended up being able to adopt a little girl from Haiti, which was very sick at the point, and you know, she'd been in an orphanage. No one wanted her, really. That turned her. And she says, Missy Melissa is the biggest gift God could have given her apart from salvation. And she says, let me find it. She says, when I thought God was punishing me, he was actually looking out for me. He was protecting me. God is a good God. And he sees the bigger picture. Like, he has the full plan for our lives. And so when we have one of those seriously God moments, we need to take our eyes off what is happening to us right now and look towards God and trust him that he's got a good plan and he can use even this. Now, according to psychologists, when we have a big perspective, so it's not even just a Christian thing, They know that we have a better understanding of who we actually are in life if we look at the bigger perspective of our lives, a better understanding of who we are. We find purpose in our lives. We are able to deal with challenges far better, and we tend to be more positive about life. And they even say we tend to be more empathetic and have a desire to actually help other people. You look away from yourself, you look towards others. And that Paul was like that. Paul recognized that the bigger picture of his life was actually to live for Christ. In Philippians, he says, "For me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I live, I can do more fruitful work for Christ." And not only was Paul, he dealt with all those challenges. There were so many things that he had to suffer. He dealt with them amazingly. He didn't seem fazed. But he also had empathy for others around him. When they were on the ship and the ship was breaking apart and people had lost all hope, he was the one who was strong. And he said to the crew, "Look, guys, you're going to make it. An angel of the Lord came and told me that. You're going to be okay, so take heart." And then a little bit later, he said again, "Take heart. You're going to get through it. You're going to come through it." The experience of being shipwrecked wasn't new for Paul. He'd been shipwrecked 3 times before, and I think that probably helps a little bit too. Come through it once, you can do it again. C.S. Lewis said, "Hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny." And that is so true. Sometimes it's a little bit hard when you're in it to see that, but hardships do prepare us and they shape us. They make us stronger and they give us empathy for other people. If someone else has gone through the same thing, you can encourage them. And so maybe there's a purpose in the things we go through. We have to suffer. 2 years ago, my mom hadn't been well for quite a while and she was getting weaker and weaker. And it's just a little bit hard living in Germany. My mom living in Germany, us living here. But for some time, I'd been ringing her every day, and every day I was really stressed because I wasn't sure if she was lying on the floor somewhere and if I had to jump back on the plane and go over. So this was one of the times when, I can't remember, did she break her leg at that point? Something happened, and within a few days you book your flight, you jump on the plane, you just go. But I was so stressed because I'd done that so many times, and I was like, I don't know how much longer I can do this. And so I was sitting next to this lady, and we were chatting, I think it was on the leg from Brisbane to Singapore, and I could tell she wasn't Australian, she could tell I wasn't Australian, but couldn't pick up where we couldn't pick up where we were from. But eventually it turned out she was from Munich, like me. And so we started speaking in German, and I was telling her what was going over, she was telling me. And then she said to me, "Look, I've been in exactly the same situation that you're in at the moment." And she said, "It was incredibly hard, it was so stressful, but she said, I got through it, and you can get through it too." And at that point, it wasn't, a big thing, but for me, I needed to hear that at that point. And I was like, okay, she got through it, I can get through it. It was a real encouragement for me. Now, we all want to avoid pain, but I think the real issue with pain is if there's no purpose to it. We do tend to accept painful things when we know, you accept the pain of a cancer treatment if you know it's going to deal with your cancer. You accept the pain of childbirth because you know, you're going to get the child at the end of it. Plus, you can't really go back at that point. I was, just on a side note, I was with Francisca, who's highly pregnant. I was at the hospital. She needed to go for a checkup. They weren't sure if the baby was fine. But then this pregnant lady came in, my daughter, it's not much longer until you have to give birth. So she comes in and she was in labor, I think 4 minutes apart. And so she was lying there next to, they just had the little curtain there. And the nurses how are you going? And she's like, I just want to die. And Francisco was like, yeah. So maybe not the encouragement she wanted. This psychotherapist says also like the question why something painful happens is actually not helpful, because we may never find out why something is happening to us, but having a purpose and trusting that God has a purpose in what we're going through, that will help us with dealing with the challenges in front of us. How do we find a purpose? Like there was, just as I was going through the message, I read an article in the Australians by Greg Sheridan, and he made the observation there that there seems to be this trend among really well-known intellectuals across the world that actually turning from they all used to be atheists, and they're all turning towards Christianity. Like Jordan Peterson, you may have heard of him, and his wife after struggle with cancer. Neil Ferguson, I have to admit, I didn't know his name, but he's an influential historian. Him and his wife turned to Christianity, and the reason was, she said, and she was a Muslim, then became an atheist, now turned to Christianity, and she says, like, a life without God could not answer the simple, like, it all seemed life without God seemed, what did she say, unendurable and almost self-destructive. And she said, a life without God could not answer the simple question, what is the purpose of life? And God is the only one really who can give us a purpose. There's purpose in your pain. Romans 8:28, and we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Now, Paul was never supposed to end up in Malta, and like Malta is really out of the way, no one ever would land there. But because of this particular chain of events, like the imprisonment and the shipwreck, he ended up there. And he not only brought healing to people, but also Christianity to the island. Like, Paul is believed to have been instrumental to bringing Christianity to the island. The island today is 95% Christian and has 360 churches, and it's a small island, so it's a lot of churches. And according to oral tradition, which means there's really no documentation, but this is what we believe happened, Publius, the guy whose father he healed, became the first pastor on the island, so maybe not. Jesus experienced pain, but he knew there was a purpose in it. Like in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus knew he was about to die, like he called his disciples together, and he said, if it is possible, like, Lord, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, as you will. Like Jesus dreaded the cross and the suffering and all that came with it, like any other human being would have, but he also knew there was a purpose to it. He knew there was a bigger picture, and it wasn't just about dying on the cross, it was about the resurrection and defeating death and bringing salvation to all people. I want to draw out one more point from the story, and that is, like, Paul was bitten on his hand by the viper. In hand, the Greek word is kairos, and because of that, the other people thought, oh, okay, he's a bad guy. Like, he used his hands to kill. Hang on, I lost my spot. Okay. But later, I don't know, like if you picked up on the twist, but later in the story, Acts 28 says he placed his hands, kairos, on him and healed him. So Paul uses the hand that was attacked to actually bring healing. And it was a bigger miracle, like he used his hands to heal, but for one thing it says like he healed everyone on the island. And the other thing is like what that Publius' father was suffering from is most likely brucellosis. And it's It's caused by bacteria, can be transmitted from farm animals or untreated milk. But in humans, it can affect all sorts of organs, and it's actually quite serious. Now, today we've got antibiotics, but back then they didn't, and most likely it would have resulted in death. So, he uses his hand that the viper bites to kill him to actually bring life. The point I want to make is that you can expect, especially where God has placed your calling on you, especially what God wants you to do and what He's going to bless, that is going to, most likely, you can expect you're going to be bitten there, you're going to be challenged in that area. But should that hold us back? Now, Paul was an anointed evangelist. He was called to share the gospel. And in Acts 19, no, do I have that? Yeah. God says of Paul, "This is my chosen instrument to carry my name before the Gentiles and their kings and before the people of Israel." And that calling was constantly challenged, not only by the beatings and the shipwreck and the imprisonment, but also apparently because of how he spoke. He says what other people in 2 Corinthians, Paul quotes other people that say of him, like his letters, they're great, they're weighty and forceful, but in person, he's very unimpressive, and really his speaking amounts to nothing. That's a pretty harsh statement. And it's a little bit unclear if Paul was unskilled, or if he ever was nervous. Did he have stage fright? Did he stammer? We're not sure, but we know he faced serious challenges, and yet he didn't let that hold him back. And the thing is, he was one of the most anointed preachers in history. He preached to, he evangelized 3 continents. He wrote, was it 2/3 of the letters in the New Testament? Sip of water. And I was, just listening to different things. I was listening to this preacher, and he was obviously quite anointed. He was a great, very effective preacher. And then he came towards the end. He sort of said, "Look, I've actually always struggled with this thing. I've had a really bad stammer all my life." And I'm thinking, well, obviously he no longer has it, because he's just doing an amazing job. But he said, "No, I still have it." And but he knew he was meant to be a preacher, so he trained himself to, there's certain words that he can't say, and so he trained himself to replace it with a word with a similar meaning. But he says it's just really, your mind is constantly going, so it's actually quite exhausting. And he used to get quite frustrated. He's trying to get better at that. But he says his children like to get a milkshake. And the flavor they like, which is the opposite of chocolate, he says, but he can't pronounce that word. So, when he goes there and stands there and wants to choose the flavor that's opposite of chocolate, what is it? Vanilla. Yeah. But he says, what he does is he asks, "Oh, what flavors do you have?" And they go through all the flavors. And when they come to vanilla, he'll go, yeah, that's the one. But he says, so often it didn't work because they would have already moved on. And so they're, okay, so which one was it? At that point, then he goes "You know what, don't worry, I'll take strawberry." And he says, "I can't tell you how often I left with what I didn't want because I let it hold me back." So this one time, kids were in the back with another strawberry milkshake, and he's singing along to this worship song, and he's starting to realize that while he's singing, he has no stutter. So he turned the car around, he goes back to the place, and the girl is like, what flavor would you like? And he says, "Vanilla." And she answers, "My pleasure." And the children finally got the vanilla milkshake. The point is, the purpose to which God has chosen us, that is where we can expect to be challenged. but that shouldn't let us we shouldn't let that hold us back. Now, if we are called to build a church, and a few years ago we did get exactly that word, we can expect that there will be challenges, and like there have been challenges, but it has been anointed. It was what God called us to do. As we come to the end of the year, I think it's a good time to ask ourselves, what is the bigger picture for our life? What is the bigger picture for your life? What were the challenges this year? Like, and are they maybe, an indication of where God wants you to go? Does it have to do with career, with your profession? What's the bigger picture for our church? Like, I know the building is getting a bit small, and that's a very positive development, but in finding a solution, there are going to be challenges, and there have been challenges, but is that supposed to hold us back? So when you encounter opposition, when you encounter hardship, when you encounter pain, do not be disheartened. Like, God's got the bigger plan for your life, and in order not to be disheartened, we need to look to Him, and we need to look at the bigger picture of our lives. And God can use, whatever is going on in our lives for good. Amen.